G'day team and welcome back to Overheard in the Emergency Room. I'm Dr. Adrian Coyce, emergency medicine physician, evidence nerd, and the person my friends text when they've seen something on social media and they want to know if it's actually true. Today we're going to talk about protein. Specifically, we're going to talk about whether there is, as some corners of the internet would have you believe, a war on protein. Spoiler alert, there isn't. But the idea there is has caused enough collateral damage that I want to sit down and work through it with you properly. Let me start, as I always do, with a case from the emergency department. A 35-year-old man walks into my department with crampy abdominal pain. It's been going on for 2 or 3 days. His vital signs are normal, his abdomen is tender overall, but particularly on the left lower quadrant, which is a part of the belly that has a fairly limited differential diagnosis. His labs are pretty unremarkable and he has a mildly elevated white cell count. His CT scan shows uncomplicated diverticulitis, little pouches in the wall of his colon that have become inflamed. This is thankfully a pretty manageable diagnosis. I give him my standard diverticulitis spiel. I talk about the evidence around antibiotics and explain that for uncomplicated disease, the data now suggests that we can manage this without them. I talk about low residue eating in the acute phase, a brat-style approach of bananas, rice, applesauce, and toast for a few days while the bowel settles. And then, and this is the part that I really care about, I talk about what he eats after that. Because the single most important thing he can do to reduce his risk of this happening again is to eat more plant-forward diets, more fiber, more plants on the plate. I tell him what I tell most of my patients. Aim for plants to take up around 80% of your plate, and aim for 30 to 40 unique plant species per week in your diet. That sounds like a lot, but when you count herbs, spices, and beans, as well as grains and nuts and seeds, it is more achievable than most people expect. He nods, he's listening. And then he says the sentence that made me write this episode. I've really been on a high protein diet kick at the moment. I heard on a podcast that I should be getting 2.2 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight every day. So I've been eating a lot of beef, a lot of chicken, and a lot of eggs. I paused, and in that pause, I had what I will politely call an "oh no" moment. Because here was a young man who had heard a single number on a podcast, stripped of context, stripped of indication, stripped of any discussion of whether it applied to him, and he had rearranged his entire diet around it. In the process, he had displaced the exact foods that would have protected him from the diagnosis he was now sitting in front of me with. The beef and chicken and eggs hadn't caused his diverticulitis directly, but the fiber-rich plant foods that he had pushed off his plate. And we know that these are the foods that have robust evidence for preventing exactly this from happening. And that is the problem I want to unpack today. Not protein itself. Protein is great. Protein is essential. Your body needs it. I need it. And I'm going to spend time in the next hour telling you in detail how much you actually need. The problem is what happens when a nuanced, context-dependent piece of nutrition science gets flattened into a single number, shouted from a podcast, and then acted on by a person who has never intended to be the audience for that number in the first place. By the end of this episode, you will understand why your body needs protein, how much you actually need based on your goals, where your protein should come from, and importantly, why none of this matters if you are not lifting weights. Welcome to Overheard in the Emergency Room. Today we're going to talk about the war on protein and why the real issue is not that people are not getting enough, but they have been sold a story that has them chasing the wrong thing. Let's get into it. If you've been listening all season, you know about the 2-tier blueprint. Tier 1 is the non-negotiable foundation: diet, exercise, sleep, stress management, and having a primary care physician. Tier 2 is the upgrade layer. It's useful, but only if Tier 1 is in place. Protein is a Tier 1 topic. It is part of the diet pillar, and like most Tier 1 topics, the headline is boringly simple: eat enough and choose wisely. It is only when the marketing department gets hold of it that it begins to get a little weird. So before we talk about how much, let's talk about why. Why does your body need protein? Protein is not a simple thing. It's a category. It's a collection of molecules made up of amino acids in different combinations and arrangements that your body uses as building blocks for almost everything structural and functional. Your muscles are protein, your skin is protein, your enzymes are protein, Your immune system, the antibodies that recognize viruses you encountered last flu season, those are also protein. Your hair, your nails, the collagen in your joints, the hemoglobin in your red blood cells, the transporters that move sodium across your cell membranes, the receptors that let insulin tell your cells to take up glucose, protein, protein, protein. 9 of those amino acids are classified as essential, which in nutrition speak means your body cannot make them. You have to eat them. Miss enough of them for long enough and your body starts breaking down its own tissue, its own muscle to liberate those amino acids it needs for more urgent jobs. That is the baseline reason we need dietary protein. It is a non-negotiable input. The question has never been whether you need it. The question has always been how much and for what purpose. Where the 0.8 grams per kilogram number actually comes from. You may have heard this number before. 0.8 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight per day. That is the current recommended dietary allowance, or RDA, for adults in most Western countries. Let's look at where that number actually came from, because it matters. The modern RDA is largely based on a 2003 meta-analysis by Rand and colleagues published in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition. They pooled data from 235 subjects across 19 separate studies. The methods those studies used was nitrogen balance. The principle is straightforward. Protein is the only macronutrient that contains nitrogen. So if you measure how much nitrogen a person is eating and how much they are excreting in their urine and stool, you can work out whether they are in a net positive or net negative protein state. The Rand meta-analysis concluded that 0.83 grams per kilogram per day was the intake at which roughly 97.5% of healthy adults would maintain nitrogen equilibrium. That is where the 0.8 number comes from. It is, and this is important, the lowest intake at which a healthy adult will not lose body nitrogen. It is the floor. It is the number you need to not become deficient. It was never, and this point is key, the number you need to thrive. In fact, the same dietary reference intakes document that enshrined the 0.8 number openly acknowledges that the nitrogen balance method has serious limitations. So much so that the document itself states that nitrogen balance should no longer be regarded as the gold standard for determining protein requirements. That is the regulatory body, essentially saying, we know this number has problems, but it is what we have. The case for more than 0.8 grams, enter Stuart Phillips. He is a protein researcher at McMaster University in Canada. And if you read the academic literature on human protein requirements, his name is everywhere. In 2016, Phillips and colleagues published a review in Applied Physiology, Nutrition and Metabolism titled, and I love this title, Protein Requirements Beyond the RDA. Their argument is that while 0.8 grams per kilogram may be adequate to prevent frank deficiency, it is very likely inadequate for what most of us actually care about, maintaining muscle. Preventing sarcopenia, that is the progressive loss of muscle mass and strength with age. Supporting healthy body composition, recovering from minor stresses of everyday life. Their conclusion, based on a synthesis of the evidence, was that high-quality protein intakes in the range of 1.2 to 1.6 grams per kilogram per day represent a more reasonable target for optimizing health outcomes in adults. So if you want a headline number for an otherwise healthy adult who is lifting weights, and we'll come back to that lifting weights part a lot, something in the range of 1 to 1.2 grams per kilogram per day is a pretty sensible floor, and 1.6 grams per kilogram is a reasonable ceiling for most people. Phillips himself has said publicly that, and quote, for optimal health, the average adult should aim to eat around 1 to 1.2 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight daily. Eating this amount, along with regular bouts of strength training, can help you build and maintain lean muscle as you age and stave off conditions such as sarcopenia. Notice the structure of that sentence. It's not eat more protein. It is eat this much and lift weights. The protein without the stimulus is like having a race car in the driveway. It's beautiful to look at, but it's totally useless without a driver. All right, let's get into the science properly. I said at the top of the episode that there are three distinct populations I want to think about separately because the protein conversation looks different for each of them. These populations are otherwise healthy adults, athletes and people actively trying to build muscle and strength, and older adults. So let's just say over the age of 65. We're going to walk through the evidence for each because the evidence is genuinely different for each of these groups. Let's start with otherwise healthy adults. So this is the person who is not an athlete, not in their mid-70s, not in a catabolic disease state. It's just a regular adult who wants to be healthy, move well, feel good, and age well. The key paper here is a 2022 meta-analysis by Tagawa and colleagues that was published in Sports Medicine Open. They pulled together randomized control trials and looked at the dose-response relationship between total protein intake and changes in muscle strength in people doing resistance training. So let's do a quick PICO breakdown because this is how I want you to learn to read a paper. Start with population. They had healthy adults across a range of ages who are enrolled in resistance training programs. The intervention included varying levels of protein intake from low to high. The comparator was different intake levels against each other to map them on a dose-response curve. And the outcomes were the change in muscle strength and, in many of the pooled studies, lean body mass. What they found was a dose-response curve. As protein intake went up, strength gains went up, but, and this is the crucial part, the curve flattened. Benefits continued to accrue up to about 1.5 grams per kilogram per day. Beyond that, the curve went essentially flat. More protein did not mean more strength. A separate systematic review by Nunes and colleagues published in 2022 in the Journal of Cachexia, Sarcopenia and Muscle found a similar ceiling. They landed at around 1.3 grams per kilogram per day, above which additional protein provided no additional benefit for lean body mass or strength, provided resistance training was part of the picture. So what does this tell us? For a healthy resistance training adult, somewhere between 1.2 and 1.6 grams per kilogram per day is the sweet spot. Below that, you are likely leaving some gains on the table. Above that, you are not getting more for your money. The law of diminishing returns is alive and well. For context, a 70 kilogram adult at 1.2 grams per kilogram is eating 84 grams of protein per day. At 1.6 grams per kilogram, they're eating 112 grams per day. Now, what does the average American eat? I pulled the CDC data. The average adult in the United States consumes around 90 to 100 grams of protein per day. The average adult female consumes 65 to 75 grams per day. In Australia, the figures are very similar. The average daily protein intake sits at around 95 grams. Most adults are already hitting or very close to hitting the higher end of the target without even trying, without tracking, without following a single influencer on social media. And overall protein intake has been trending up over time, not down. There is no population level protein deficiency in high income countries. That is simply not a real problem. Now let's move up the intensity ladder. If you are training hard, regular resistance training, maybe competing in a strength or a physique sport, maybe in a cut or a bulk, your protein needs are higher. The major sports nutrition organizations, including the International Society of Sports Nutrition and American Colleges of Sports Medicine, converge on a range of around 1.4 to 2 grams per kilogram per day for athletes. The highly cited meta-analysis by Morton and colleagues in 2017 landed on roughly 1.6 grams per kilo per day as the intake above which resistance training induced gains in fat-free mass no longer meaningfully increased, with a plausible upper bound at the outer edge of the confidence interval of about 2.2 grams per kilogram in some analyses. So when you hear influencers yelling that you need 2.2 grams per kilogram per day, they are not pulling that number out of thin air. It is the upper bound of the confidence interval in a specific population of trained athletes maximizing hypertrophy. It is not a baseline recommendation for the general public. It is not what my 35-year-old diverticulitis patient needed. Now, let me introduce you to a paper I love because it directly pulls the rug from under one of the loudest claims in this space. Javier Lorraine and colleagues. It was published in Sports Medicine in 2021. They ran a controlled trial comparing habitual vegans and habitual omnivores undertaking identical resistance training programs. Both groups ate a protein-matched diet at 1.6 grams per kilogram per day. Both groups trained identically for 12 weeks. The result? There were no differences in hypertrophy. There was no difference in strength gains, none at all. Vegans built just as much muscle and got just as strong as the omnivores did, as long as their total protein intake was adequate. That is a direct RCT level refutation of the claim that animal protein is necessary for building muscle. If you give the body the stimulus, the weights, and you give it enough of the building blocks, the protein, it does not care whether those building blocks came from a cow or from a chickpea. A 2024 meta-analysis on protein intake and athletic performance published in Frontiers in Nutrition reinforced these findings across a broader range of sports and outcomes. And a 2025 randomized controlled trial by Santini and colleagues, published in the Journal of the International Society of Sports Nutrition, compared animal-based and plant-based blends of protein as complementary dietary protein during resistance training, and they found similar effects on muscle adaptation. The evidence has quietly, steadily piled up against the idea that you need animal protein to build muscle. You just need protein. The source matters much less than the total, provided you are eating a varied diet. Now let's talk about the group where the protein conversation actually gets more urgent, in the adults over 65. Aging does two things to muscle that are relevant here. First, it reduces the efficiency with which your body responds to dietary protein, a phenomenon called anabolic resistance. A younger adult's muscle responds briskly to a protein-containing meal. An older adult's muscle needs a larger dose of protein to trigger the same response. There's a great review on this by Aragon and colleagues in Nutrition Reviews titled Age-Related Muscle Anabolic Resistance, Inevitable or Preventable? And their answer is, thankfully, it is preventable. Second, episodes of illness, hospitalization, reduced mobility, these all accelerate muscle loss in older adults in a way that just doesn't happen in younger people. That is why sarcopenia, that clinical loss of muscle mass and strength with age, is such a huge determinant of independent fall risk, mortality, and quality of life in older people. For older adults, the evidence supports a higher baseline protein intake. The ESPEN expert group, that is the European Society for Clinical Nutrition and Metabolism, recommends at least 1 to 1.2 grams per kilogram per day for healthy older adults and 1.2 to 1.5 grams per kilo per day for older adults with acute or chronic disease or injury. A 2022 meta-analysis by Nunez and colleagues in the Journal of Cachexia confirmed that older adults benefit from protein intakes above the RTA, particularly when combined with resistance training. And here is a finding that I think is genuinely important, and that I would really like you to hear if you have a parent or grandparent in this age group. A 2025 systematic review and meta-analysis by Zhang and colleagues, published in BMC Geriatrics, looked specifically at protein supplementation in inactive older adults. The finding? Protein supplementation alone without exercise did not meaningfully improve muscle mass, muscle strength, or physical performance. Let's read that again. Protein without exercise did not help. This is the single most important finding in this entire episode, and it is why the lifting weights caveat is not optional. You cannot protein your way out of sarcopenia. You can only resistance train your way out of sarcopenia, with adequate protein as the fuel that makes the training effective. Let me briefly address the protein quality argument, because it is the main technical hook that people use to argue for animal over plant sources. There are two main scoring systems in use. The older one is the PDCAAS, the Protein Digestibility Corrected Amino Acid Score. The newer one, more refined one, is the DIAS, the Digestible Indispensable Amino Acid Score. Both of them try to quantify how well a food provides all 9 essential amino acids relative to what the body needs and correct for how well that protein is digested. Animal proteins tend to score higher in these systems. That is true. It's not controversial. But here is what gets left out of the social media version of that fact. First, these scoring systems were developed to identify the highest quality single protein sources for food scarcity. They were designed for parts of the world where children are protein deficient and need the most efficient source they can access. They were not designed to tell a well-fed adult in a high-income country which single food they should be built around. Second, the scores are calculated based on the amino acid that is the lowest in a given food. If you only ate one plant protein for every meal for your entire life, that might matter. But no one eats like that. A varied plant diet, including legumes, grains, nuts, seeds, vegetables, easily provides all 9 essential amino acids in adequate quantities. Rice and beans, hummus and pita, lentil dal and whole grain flatbread. Every traditional plant-based cuisine in the world has solved this problem already. Third, the digestibility figures used in the DIAS are typically measured on raw or minimally processed foods. Most of the plant protein sources we actually eat are cooked, soaked, sprouted, fermented, or processed in ways that substantially improve their digestibility. The scores we use underestimate the real-world nutritional availability of that plant protein. And fourth, the ultimate test is the outcome test. If plant protein were genuinely inferior for building muscle, the heavier Lorraine trial would have shown it. It did not. Habitual vegans matched omnivores for strength and hypertrophy when protein intake was matched. The quality argument is a technical distinction that has been weaponized into an everyday dietary prescription. The underlying science does not support that translation. So, which type of protein should you actually eat? This is where I want to spend a few minutes because it is part of the conversation that the eat 2.2 grams per kilogram crowd almost never gets to. It is not enough to hit the protein number. The source matters for long-term health. A landmark paper published in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition in 2024 by Glenn and colleagues uses the Nurses' Health Study, Nurses' Health Study 2, and the Health Professionals Follow-Up Study, which together track thousands of participants for decades. They found that replacing animal protein with plant protein was associated with a meaningful reduction in the risk of cardiovascular disease and coronary artery disease. That is 3 of the largest prospective cohorts in nutrition science, all converging on the same finding. Swap plants for animals. Your heart does better. Mechanistically, this makes sense. Animal protein sources, particularly red and processed meat, come packaged with saturated fat, heme iron, and other compounds that drive atherosclerosis. Plant protein sources come packaged with fiber, polyphenols, magnesium, potassium, and phytochemicals that actively reduce cardiovascular disease risk. You are not just getting a different protein, you are getting a different whole food matrix. This is where my diverticulitis patient comes back into the frame. He thought he was optimizing his diet. What he was actually doing was trading foods that protected his colon for foods that didn't. He was hitting a number, but he was missing the point entirely. So before we name the myths, I want to flag the tactics because this topic is an absolute goldmine for the purveyors of misinformation. You're going to see cherry picking, where someone pulls out the one study or the one data point that supports their claim and ignores the body of evidence that doesn't. You're going to see the appeal to nature fallacy, the idea that because humans evolved to eat meat or because meat is natural, it is therefore optimal. You're going to see false equivalence. So that's treating a confidence interval in a narrow, highly trained population as a general recommendation for everyone. And you're going to see motivated reasoning, where someone has a product to sell or a podcast guest to please or a lifestyle to justify. And the science gets stretched as a result to fit. Armed with those, let's go. So myth 1, there is a war on protein.
These new dietary guidelines end the war against protein, end the war against saturated fats, and they get Americans good food again.
The White House tweeted a graphic over the weekend of Health and Human Services Secretary Robert F. Kennedy Jr. that said, quote, "We are ending the war on protein. Finally, That's right. The White House tweeted a graphic of Robert F. Kennedy Jr. that said, quote, "We are ending the war on protein."
You might be seeing a lot of social media posts pushing you to load up on steaks, beef tallow, pork, bacon, and other meat products, especially now that the new dietary guidelines for Americans encourage us to eat more animal protein. But the science is clear. A diet high in red meat has been linked to cardiovascular disease, stroke, diabetes, colorectal cancer, and premature death. Red meat is one of the top sources of saturated fat in the average American's diet. Some recent headlines say that saturated fat has been unfairly villainized, but that's not true. Study after study shows that eating too much saturated fat raises LDL, or bad cholesterol, and LDL is a known cause of heart disease.
The claim is that mainstream nutrition science is undervaluing protein, that the RDA is conspiratorially low, and that public health is somehow suppressing what people actually need to eat. The manipulation tactics at play here are cherry picking and motivated reasoning. And I'll be upfront, there is legitimate scientific critique of the current RDA, which we discussed in segment 2. The 0.8 number is probably too low for optimal health. I agree with Professor Phillips on that. So does most of the current protein research community as well. But that is not what the war on protein narrative is actually saying. The war on protein narrative claims that the general public is under-consuming protein. Let's test that. The average American male eats 90 to 100 grams of protein per day. The average American female eats 65 to 75 grams per day. The average Aussie adult eats 95 grams per day. At a population level, protein intakes have been stable or rising for decades. The food industry has responded by adding high protein labels to everything from tortilla chips to coffee. Starbucks now sells a protein latte. You can buy protein water, protein ice cream, protein popcorn, protein pancakes, protein pasta. If this is a war, the protein side is winning in a landslide. Even better, for the subset of people who really do want to be up in the 1.2 to 1.6 gram per kilogram range and who might not be getting there from food alone, a scoop of protein powder in a smoothie is a perfectly fine option. Protein supplements are cheap, safe, and for most people, very convenient. That's a tier 2 tool that is available for everyone. The problem is not that people are being deprived of protein. The problem is that The problem is not that people are being deprived of protein. The problem is that a legitimate scientific critique of an outdated RDA has been hijacked by a marketing apparatus and a subset of online influencers who benefit financially or in attention terms from selling people back a number they already hit. So here's your one-line takeaway. There is no war on protein. The average adult is already eating plenty. The issue is not quantity, it is where that protein is coming from and whether you are doing the strength training that makes it matter. Myth number 2, plant protein is inferior to animal protein. This one leans hard on the appeal to nature fallacy. Humans evolved to eat meat, combined with a selective reading of PDCAAS and DIAAS protein quality scores. Here is the 4-pillar evidence breakdown in the framework we have been using all season. Mechanism. All plants contain all 9 essential amino acids. That is not a matter of opinion. It is a biochemical reality. Plants differ in their relative amounts of each amino acid. Legumes are relatively lower in methionine. Grains are relatively lower in lysine. When you combine them, you hit all full essential amino acid profiles. Digestibility scores for plant proteins are also routinely measured on raw, uncooked preparations, which understates the real-world bioavailability of how people actually eat and prepare these foods. Genetics. The "we evolved to eat meat" argument is a misreading of evolutionary biology. Human beings are omnivores. Our genes do not require meat. There is no genetic marker that says must eat animal protein or muscle will not grow. Epidemiology. The Harvard cohort data from the Nurses' Health Study and Health Professionals Follow-Up Study, it shows that replacing animal protein with plant protein is associated with the reduced cardiovascular disease and coronary heart disease risk. When you look at long-term health outcomes at a population level, plant protein wins. The RCTs. The heavier Lorraine trial showed no difference in strength and hypertrophy between vegans and omnivores when protein intake was matched at 1.6 grams per kilogram per day. The 2025 Centini trial showed similar resistance training adaptations with animal-based versus plant-based protein blends. 4 pillars, same answer. Here's your one-line takeaway. If you give yourself the stimulus, weight training, and you eat enough total protein, even a habitual vegan will build just as much muscle and get just as strong as the habitual omnivore. Hit the number, eat a varied diet, and stop worrying about the amino acid spreadsheet. Myth number 3. If some protein is good, more is always better. Now, this is one of my favorite ones because it is the logical fallacy that underpins half of the supplement industry. The tactic is false extrapolation, taking a relationship that is true in a narrow range and assuming it is linear forever in all populations. The Tagawa dose-response meta-analysis is the cleanest answer here. The curve goes up and then the curve flattens, above around 1.5 grams per kilogram per day in the context of resistance training. Additional protein does not give you additional strength or additional muscle. You are quite literally wasting your money and in many cases your digestive comfort. And there is an opportunity cost worth flagging. Every gram of protein you shovel in above what your body can use is a gram that displaces fiber or vegetables or legumes or whole grains. The cost of chasing 2.2 grams per kilo per day when your body only needs 1.4 to 1.6 is not paid in the protein aisle. It is paid in the vegetable aisle you skipped to make room for it. That cost showed up in my department in the form of a 35-year-old with diverticulitis. Protein has a ceiling. For resistance training adults, that ceiling is around 1.5 to 1.6 grams per kilogram per day. More than that is not more muscle. It's just more food, and you need to take in the foods that matter. Let's translate all this into practical action. In the 2-tier blueprint, I want to think about where this lands across the 5 tier 1 pillars. So let's start with diet. We should be aiming for 1 to 1.2 grams per kilogram per day if you are healthy adult maintaining muscle. Aim for 1.2 to 1.6 grams per kilo per day if you are actively training for strength and hypertrophy, or if you are over 65 years of age. I want you to prioritize plant sources. So that's legumes, lentils, beans, tofu, tempeh, edamame, peas, whole grains, nuts and seeds. Animal sources are fine as complements, but they should not dominate your plate. And please do not replace fiber-rich plant foods your colon needs to protect itself. My diverticulitis patients send you their regards. Exercise, and this is a big one. Resistance training at least once per week, preferably 3 times per week, is so important. This is the single most leveraged intervention in this whole episode. Without it, every other protein decision is downgraded in effectiveness. The Zhang 2025 meta-analysis in older adults is the cleanest evidence. Protein without the stimulus of exercise does not prevent muscle loss. And over 80% of Americans are currently not meeting the minimum physical activity requirements. If you are one of them, this is the intervention that will move the needle the most, not the protein powder, the protein chips, or the protein ice cream. Sleep. Protein synthesis happens at night. If you are not sleeping well, you are not recovering well, and your body's ability to use the protein you are eating will be blunted. This topic is adjacent to today's, but it's worth flagging. Protein does not rescue poor sleep. Meditation and stress management. Chronic stress drives cortisol, which is catabolic. It's actively breaking down that muscle. Not directly relevant to the dosing question, but another reminder that tier 1 is a system, not a single dial. Your primary care physician. If you are on a high protein diet and you are unsure whether it's right for you, especially if you have kidney disease, a history of gout, or any chronic condition that affects how your body processes protein, please talk to your primary care provider. Most healthy adults can safely eat up to 1.6 to 2 grams per kilo per day without an issue. But most is not everyone. Individual context matters, and that is what your PCP is for. Okay, let's pull this into something you can actually do this week. Number 1, lift something heavy. If you only take one thing from this episode, it is this. Start resistance training. Do it once a week, twice a week, 3 if you can. Body weight if you're new to it. Dumbbells or barbells as you build up, machines at the gym if this is what feels comfortable for you. All of it works. If you don't know where to start, go to my website, drkois.com. I have training platform partnerships and free training resources there, including template exercise resistance training programs you can follow straight out of the gate. No gimmicks, no subscriptions, just programs and information. Number 2, track what you actually eat for a week. Most people have no idea how much protein they are actually eating. I would strongly recommend downloading an app called Chronometer. Now, I get no kickback from them at all. I just think it's an excellent app. Start logging your food for 7 consecutive days. This app is great because you can take photos of your plate and it recognizes what's on it. At the end of the week, you will know your average daily protein intake in grams per kilogram of body weight. You may be surprised. Most of my patients find that they're already hitting their target without even trying. Some find they're short, and either way, now you know, and you can adjust the data without the dogma. Number 3, shift the source. Don't do it all at once. Not all or nothing, just gradually. Swap one animal-based meal a day for a plant-based one. Beans instead of beef, tofu instead of chicken, lentils instead of mince, hummus instead of deli meat. The Harvard cohort data tells us that this shift, even partial, reduces cardiovascular disease risk over time. And it automatically increases the fiber on your plate, which your colon will thank you for. Number 4, consider a protein supplement if you need one. If you're training hard and struggling to hit your protein target from whole foods alone, especially if you're a vegan, vegetarian, or an older adult with a smaller appetite, or someone with limited cooking time, a scoop of protein powder is a perfectly fine tool. Whey, soy, pea, rice blends, all of them work. It is not mandatory though, but if you want to and can afford one, go for it. It's a tier 2 upgrade that has a legitimate place. As we close this episode out, let me come back to my diverticulitis patient. He was doing what a lot of well-intentioned people are doing. He had heard a number. He had trusted the person who said it. He had rearranged his diet around it, and in doing so, he had displaced the exact foods that would have protected him from the diagnosis he was sitting in front of me with. The tragedy of that case is not that he was eating protein. Protein's great. The tragedy is that he was chasing a target that was never meant for him, from a source that was actively working against his long-term health. And crucially, he wasn't lifting weights. So even the protein he was consuming wasn't doing the thing he thought it was doing. The advice I gave him at the bedside is the same advice I'm giving you now. Protein is important, but getting enough of it is the easy part. And most of you are already there. The harder and more important part is where it comes from and whether you are doing the training that makes it useful. So hit 1 to 1.2 grams per kilogram per day if you are a regular adult. Push toward 1.2 to 1.6 grams per kilogram if you are training hard or you are over 65. Get as much of it as you reasonably can from plants. Your cardiovascular system, your kidneys, and your colon will thank you. And for the love of the gods, lift something. Without that stimulus, the rest of this conversation is a race car in the driveway with no decent driver. There is no war on protein. There is a marketing campaign, some very loud podcasts, and a lot of confused patients walking into my department with their diet rearranged around a number they never needed. My job, and frankly, the job of this podcast, is to give you the context that got stripped out somewhere along the way. That's all we have time for today, team. Thanks so much for joining us. And before you go, please like, subscribe, and comment below so we can get more people in front of this information, particularly if you found it helpful. And if you know somebody who has rearranged their entire diet around a protein number, send them this episode. I will happily take the blame. Next episode, we are talking about supplements. This one is a special request from a friend and colleague, and it is going to be a good one. Supplements can be useful, but only for the right indication, in the right person, at the right dose. We will sort the evidence from the noise as always. Until then, have a great day. And we'll see you next time as we chase fewer bad days and more good decades. See ya.